welcome to Risk Chats with AFERM. I'm your host, Paul Marshall. Today we give a call to Sim Segal. He's the author of a fascinating paper entitled National Risk Management, a Practical ERM Approach for Federal Governments. So we discussed the notion of ERM at the federal national level, and I recommend you go download this document at the link on our website and follow along. So with that, let's talk to Sim. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm very happy today to have with us Sim Segal. He wrote a very interesting paper about national risk management. So I want to introduce everybody to Sim. Hello, Sim. How are you today?
Good. How are you, Paul?
Doing great. Well, why don't we just start off a little bit about your background and, your interest and background in risk management and, kind of why you decided to put this paper together.
Sure, I'd be glad to. Thank you. So, excuse me, I'm president of Synergy Consulting. It's a firm based in Manhattan specializing exclusively in ERM. I'm also of a side job as founder and academic director of the ERM program at Columbia University, which is now the largest in the world. I'm also author of, an ERM book published by Wiley and typically in the top 10 in its category in Amazon, called Corporate Value of Enterprise Risk Management. I've formerly served as vice president on the Society of Actuaries Board of Directors. I'm an actuary by trade, so that's my profession. And I was their first chairman of their risk committee, where I led the design and implementation of their ERM program. I'm also a fellow of the Society of Actuaries and a chartered enterprise risk analyst. Prior to starting my own firm, in 2010, I led ERM consulting practices at larger firms like Deloitte Consulting, Aon, and Watson Wyatt, which is now part of Willis Towers Watson.
That's great. So now, do you have any kind of background in governmental ERM aside from the paper, or is that something you had worked in the past as well?
Well, I've done a little bit of work in ERM for government agencies, and I've also had a lot of conversations with agency chief risk officers, and there's a chapter in my book that covers applying this methodology I came up with on ERM to government to non-corporate entities in general, and government is one of those. And I've been urged by some of the folks in government ERM to expand on those thoughts, and that's one of the things that led to the paper.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about this paper. You mentioned one reason, but what were some of the reasons why, you wanted to put this paper together, and who did you work with to put it together?
Yeah, I have long thought that we should have a national chief risk officer, and I'm not sure when I started exactly thinking about it, but I do remember one of the drivers was after reading the 9/11 Commission report and thinking about the setting up of the ODNI, the Director of National Intelligence, is an ERM-like approach. The fix of, hey, we weren't looking at all different pieces of information, putting it together and getting a whole picture of what's going on. So it's an ERM-like approach to gather things together, but only for terrorism risk. So the Director of National Intelligence sorts out all the info on terrorism and is responsible for reporting directly to the President and giving a picture on just that one risk type. And I thought, well, that's a first step. And taking the next step would be applying, having a role that would do that for all sources of risk and sorting that out. I had proposed writing a paper on what a national chief risk officer would look like, or how a national CRO might develop a national ERM program, and I approached the Joint Risk Management section of the JRMS, which is a joint effort between three risk organizations, research and educational organizations. One is the Society of Actuaries, which is an international organization, the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, which is a national organization, and the Casualty Actuarial Society, an international organization. And they funded the paper, and their interest is, actuaries are the world's oldest risk profession. They're experts at long-term projections involving multiply interacting decrements such as mortality, morbidity, longevity, investment rates, economic cycles, etc. So it's a natural alignment with their interests to show what actuaries could do in that space. And so that, together with urging of some colleagues in government, it spurred me to really get moving on the paper, either write the paper or perhaps a second book devoted just to that topic, and that's a future possibility.
And what would you say, what really are the benefits of putting into place a national risk management program for a federal government?
Yeah, well, in a way, if you think about the question, if you could wipe out everything that exists in terms of strictures and you had the entire federal budget, how might you allocate it? How would, if you were asked to inform where should we put it to make the best decisions to advance the national goals, how would you do that? And ERM can help answer that question after a few questions are answered first, like what are your objectives, how do you measure them? But what you end up with is 5 major improvements. One is just forecasts. Basic forecasts, an ERM method, if done correctly, of course, can improve forecasts. Just the baseline forecasts even get more rigorous, and that's one of the low-hanging fruit of applying a value-based enterprise risk management method, is just strengthen the basic baseline projections. But beyond that is understanding confidence ranges around various levels of over or underperformance, in part by extracting and leveraging information from subject matter experts on a consistent basis. So that's number one, is just basic forecasts are improved. The second is simulations. So you get a more rigorous simulation tool, which improves your ability to understand the integrated impact of potential changes in the environment, national or global situation, in terms of its impact on the critical national objectives. So that's the second, is what if things change and how does that affect us and what we're doing in our goals. The third is prioritization. It improves focus on the most important threats, either individual threats or combination threats, which can be the most damaging, using a quantitative model that captures the full impact of the events, including offsetting or exacerbating effects. So prioritization is really important, of course, especially with limited time, attention, and resources. The fourth thing it does is enhances decision-making in general, of course, starting with the most important decisions. You get a more robust and informed picture, an integrated picture of the impact of potential decisions. So rather than just looking at, well, what if things change? Well, what if we make decisions differently, ranging from strategic planning to budgeting to risk mitigation. So a whole range of types of decisions can be enhanced with this information. And lastly, and partly overlapping with these, is success. You have an increased likelihood of achieving critical national objectives once you have ERM applied at a national level.
Right, and something else I wanted to ask you about. Up front in the paper, you say that your approach to ERM is a value-based approach. Can you explain a little bit what that means?
Yeah, it's a little bit different approach, and it's an emerging approach that's getting more and more adopted. Traditional approaches to ERM have challenges. Most use COSO or ISO 31000. It's pretty similar in practice type of approach. And there's several weaknesses with that I've identified many years ago. And the way it first sparked was, I remember someone asking me the question, how do you make the business case for enterprise risk management? And I thought, well, I've done a lot of work in value-based management. So value-based management is an old concept, just understanding the drivers of value, whatever it is the organization values and how we measure it, and making it go up. And that's the best way to make a business case for anything. And my entire life has been in risk and understanding risk. And so I realized the two really needed to come together. I mean, the planning people typically look at sort of upside. We invest in this, we do this, we're going to get all these benefits. It's going to be a big, that hockey stick of performance going on up, and they look at the upsides. And the risk folks traditionally only looked at the downside. And I realized the two needed to come together. We needed to speak the same language, both risk and reward, because that's the most common phrase in any business decision is risk reward. We have to have the right trade-offs and the right profile there, and we have to really understand both with the same level of rigor. It was missing. So I took the value-based work that I'd done and the risk work and value-based management work and the risk management, enterprise risk management work, and married them together. So this also was developed in response to 3 main challenges I saw with traditional ERM approaches. Traditional ERM has an inability to quantify the hard-to-quantify risks, the strategic and operational risk. And that's what I call the holy grail of ERM, is how do you do that? Everyone's trying to figure out how do you practically quantify on a consistent basis those risks. Second, I saw that most ERM programs had an unclear definition of risk appetite, a lot of confusion about what it was, how do you define it, how do you state it clearly. So that's been lacking. And the third is just the basic ability to use ERM to inform decision making. A lot of people do ERM and it sits in a binder or sits in a report and it doesn't actually change things. People cannot use it to make decisions because of the way it is. So that's what led to it. At its essence, a value-based enterprise risk management approach has the risk in general defined as anything that causes a deviation from your baseline strategic plan goals. So that immediately connects ERM to strategic planning, which leads to buy-in by stakeholders because it measures the impact on what everybody knows they have to care about. Whatever's in our strategic plan, it's in the plan. We have to deliver. Anything, if we measure things by what causes us to miss that or overachieve it, now we're interested. It also helps us focus on key risks, not minutia. A lot of ERM programs are really an enterprise risk management approach. In other words, they take risks at really tiny granular levels and just aggregate them into some giant software or something and track it. That's not effective. It really should be coupled enterprise risk management. So it should be enterprise level risk, large aspects that move things up or down. Should be the focus, and that helps when you're looking at things that can really impact our achievement of plan goals. The second thing is that it provides both risk and reward information, as I mentioned, which is critical for decision making. Unlike traditional ERM, which often only looks at downside risk exposure and often only super downside. Lastly, this approach quantifies all sources of risk in a rigorous yet practical way. It's also consistent, which allows aggregation. So it allows prioritization across all risk types. It supports decision making. Traditional approaches give you red, yellow, green colors, high, medium, and low, red, yellow, green qualitative information. That's not the way to make a business decision. Nobody's going to invest or shift resources based on that. And also, one of the keys to the value-based approach is defining risks by their originating source. This is another common mistake in ERM programs, is that risks are sometimes defined as the source of risk, sometimes by the outcome. People say, we just may miss this goal. Well, that's not a risk. That's not a source of risk. There are maybe 85 different things that could cause that. What do you mean? Or sometimes defined as an intermediate impact. Like people will often have reputational risk on their list, and that's not a source of risk. There may be many different things that rise to the level of an impact that could generate reputational damage, either temporary or lasting, which then downstream impacts our goals, so we care about it. And we need to install that universal, consistent discipline of looking at risk by source, which gives a better context for even evaluating qualitatively what we think about the likelihood of how something comes about. It changes our opinion of how likely it is, of course. And we also have to go to the source so that we make sure to capture all the downstream impacts to accurately quantify. So the value-based approach really fixes a lot of problems of traditional enterprise risk management.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's a good message for our federal U.S. programs because, I think a lot of them are still based on, what all things could go wrong as opposed to what things could we do right, so to speak. So I really like your approach.
Thank you. Yeah, it is true. That is the most common method used.
Well, let's talk about some skill sets here because, what you're talking about sounds like a daunting job to kind of look across the entire government here and, manage risks. What would you consider the qualifications for a good national risk officer? What background would they need to have, or what qualities would they need to have?
Well, good question. It's tough to visualize a role that hasn't existed yet. It's so unique, but like any chief risk officer, there are three main types of functions. You would be leading ERM activities. You would maintain consistency of approaches, tools, and techniques, and you're also responsible for building buy-in for the approach, which really hinges a lot on the methodology, but it also has a lot to do with communication. So that's the main functions. In terms of the knowledge, experience, and skill that they have to have, it has to span a variety of areas because this is a really critical role in general for any agency, certainly at the national level. Obviously, knowledge, experience, and skill in enterprise risk management is required. Also, knowledge, experience, and skill in risk management and management in general, with preference for expertise in at least one of the following: either strategic risk, which the way I'm defining it is risk such as strategy development risk, strategy execution risk, regulatory risk, supplier risk, governance risk, also, or operational risk, which is HR risk, IT or cyber risk, disasters, both natural like pandemic or man-made like war or terrorism, process risk, compliance risk, etc., or financial risk, which is a typical market credit, liquidity, commodity price risk, currency risk, economic risk, insurance risk, such as unexpected changes, in morbidity, mortality, longevity, demographic risk, such as unexpected changes in reproductive and working life patterns, unexpected changes in immigration. Another aspect of the knowledge, experience, and skill required would be modeling. Being able to handle dynamic projections of multiply interacting variables over extremely long time horizons, being able to develop credible assumptions that are suitable for both near-term and long-term projections. Leadership is another aspect, just being able to communicate in a way to gain buy-in from key stakeholders. Pure management skills of project management, coordinating people with disparate backgrounds, formal and informal reporting relationships to the CRO. Communication, I mentioned a couple times already, but specifically expertise in the Socratic method of inquiry, understanding cognitive biases, which affect the different interviews to gather information in these processes, ability to interact at a range of levels of authority, ability to comprehend and be understood by a range of technical professionals, and also the highest degree of ethical integrity in terms of an honest, unbiased, agnostic approach to the analysis, interpretation, and reporting of the information to internal stakeholders and external stakeholders, such as public, allied nations, etc.
Right. So, and so say we found this amazing person, so they're going to come in, they're going to be our national risk officer. What would be some of the first things? How do they structure a nationwide risk program? Objectives, metrics, identifying risk, making decisions. How would this NRO structure this approach?
It's challenging, of course. This is one of the most challenging things you can imagine, but the key initial step is to succinctly express the critical national objectives and corresponding key metrics, and that is a tough exercise. In thinking through writing this white paper on how to apply the value-based enterprise risk management approach at the national level, and with an eye towards people reading that, should think of their particular agency, all the concepts that apply, but at a more narrow scope level, obviously, it's really analogous. I had to think that through. So to be able to demonstrate, at least to write out how to approach this, I had to put on a hat and think, well, if I were in that position, what would it be? I had to also write this because it was funded in a way that it was supposed to be able to be applied or thought about by any nation globally. So I had to think how it might differ from country to country. So I just came up with some examples of what if you had to make a handful of objectives. But the same process, I'm just taking a flyer and saying here's one way to think about it with an example. But the process-wise is to sit down. It's a very intense conversation, but it actually is. It takes a very short amount of time. It's usually done in a very short amount of time, like a day. But it's intense thinking about what are the objectives and which ones are subsumed in others, which ones may be correlated enough with others that they're captured. Or there's also sometimes an exercise that we go through to look at a handful of key risks that we know we're going to have, and think through how it affects different objectives and metrics, and that helps us also see which ones are again subsumed or correlated that can be succinctly expressed. It has to be just a handful, and there is no national strategic plan to begin with. So it's difficult, and people very much disagree across the country, state to state, party to party, what should be. And we're talking about national, not the responsibilities of state and city and municipalities, but just the federal government obligations and what are the objectives. So it's tricky, but there are some overarching things that people would agree on, and I picked the 4 overarching objectives and 10 underneath those of protecting life, protecting health, protecting wealth of the citizenry, and then sovereignty. So those four. So it's just an example, but the process is intense, but it can be quick, but it's challenging.
Right, and those four good examples, I think, would be relevant to any administration who's in power at the time. I mean, I think those are good examples. So, a couple more questions for you. So, we kind of talked about how would you narrow down the objectives. I'm curious though about metrics because do you develop these based on evidence or is there public perception? Because in government and politics, there's so much that's important about public perception, not just pure evidence. Have you thought about that?
Yeah, I actually did. I thought about the different. So if there were 10 objectives underneath, those four overarching objectives, then I had to think through how you would measure all of these. And some of the metrics are actual metrics. But perceptive metrics matter too, because that's how government works. So just as an example, if your military strength. So if military strength is one of our objectives that we need for sovereignty, then you might say, well, we could measure that. One proxy, just one example, might be military spend, just the annual budget for military spending and that relativity to different countries. So that's one way. Another way might be to say, well, let's look at our military spend, the ratio of our military spend together with the military spend of our closest allies as a ratio to the military spend of our top adversary and their closest allies. That's just another example. So that may be an actual number you can measure and project, but then there's perception. So if the public has a different perception of a military strength, and if it's skewed versus reality, it could lead to misfunding certain initiatives or underfunding other ones for the public-driven pressures that the government may result in. It may result in the government making decisions that are not aligned with the public good. So the national CRO has to keep an eye on those type of perceptive metrics and public service messaging or other communications to adjust for that to make sure that it doesn't get too much out of whack and leads to results that are not good for the public.
Right.
But there's a lot more to the process. I mean, you hit on a couple of really important things you got to think through. You got to think through what are the objectives. So this is not even an ERM thing, but you need it for ERM. Enterprise risk management can help you be more likely to succeed at achieving your objectives, but you first have to be clear what your objectives are. So if you can state them and say, here's what our objectives are, here's how we measure them long term, the actual perceptive metrics, then you actually got to build a model to dynamically project them in a way that's built to be able to handle risks to show how it would change. So first you build the baseline, and that baseline at that high level, it tends to pull information from all different types of models, and it actually is a model test, and it validates and finds disconnects between different models. So it's a good exercise to go through just in the terms of the baseline projection. And then you go through a process to identify risks, which is typically in a qualitative risk assessment, interviews with 2 to 3 dozen leaders. That's a qualitative scoring, likelihood, severity, individually come up with what the risks are, vote on everybody's risk, have a consensus meeting, and draw the line between a longer list of risks and separate that between key risks, which could be the larger ones, versus the non-key, which the non-key are just monitored with key risk indicators over time. The key risk indicators are advanced to a second step, which is typically missing in traditional enterprise risk management, which is to actually quantify the risks. And having this model that I described is built in a way that it can quantify any type of risk on a consistent basis in terms of how it affects what we care about. And that's really the key. The value-based means we're going to clarify first what we care about, what everybody knows they have to protect. And we don't want it to go down, we want it to go up. And then project that dynamically and measure risks individually, find what risk we care about. And then the second step is to quantify them by developing individual deterministic risk scenarios with subject matter experts. So it's a probabilistic, deterministic approach to thinking about what individual sources of risk can happen, what combinations can happen, mapping out different discrete scenarios of how it would actually play out by pulling on subject matter expertise, documenting, sharing that vertically and horizontally to vet it, putting it into the model. We end up getting better prioritization of individual risk combinations. We understand the overall likelihood of achieving plan or exceeding it or missing it by a certain amount. And that tool is then used to inform decision-making, understanding our risk appetite, our risk exposure, informing risk appetite and risk limits, looking at how the environment might change, looking at how we might make decisions differently, whether it's new trading partners, different alliances, different mitigation and investments in infrastructure, what have you, across all different risks. It doesn't matter. We can really evaluate any spend or shift of resources in terms of, is it going to help us more likely achieve our goals? And it can also look at the interconnectedness between a lot of different factors and drivers and sources, so there's a lot less unexpected consequences, because the National Chief Risk Officer is in a position to be able to evaluate any change in the environment externally or internal decisions or potential decisions, and how things might play out, which aspects might be affected, how it might change, and what is the best decision to make at that time.
Absolutely. And just for our listeners, again, I'm going to provide a link to your paper on our website. It's a great paper. I mean, all the things that you're mentioning, these are in the paper. It's a very thorough, amazingly well thought out, and very clearly, structured paper that I think is just very interesting. And not just for a national risk program, but for, your own agency risk program. I think you have some really interesting and very structured approaches in there. So I think it's a great paper.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, and so just a couple more questions for you, and this is just kind of a quick little podcast to get people interested in the paper. So I just kind of wanted to have a couple last questions for you. Kind of going over to, do you think do you think the U.S. federal government is ready for a national risk program? Have you seen some positive signs out there that this is a possibility?
Well, it's tough to. That's a great question. I hope so. I hope so. I don't know. I was very encouraged by the OMB's circular A123, pushing everybody to do enterprise risk management. That was really encouraging. Various aspects of that is being done in different ways in terms of implementation. I was encouraged a couple of years ago when COSO. They admitted their methodology didn't work, and they revised it. And I saw that they borrowed a couple of concepts from the value-based approach, which is, hey, we should be defining risk as deviation from strategic plan. We should be looking at risk by source. I think that move is in a correct direction, and that is the most common method used in government, although I'm not sure that the revisions are as widely adopted. I think people are still using the old COSO, but I think things are heading in the right direction. I think that the need is certainly there. And I have heard some murmurings that maybe there's some committees already thinking about not quite that, but moving in that direction of the aggregate look across the country.
Right. Yeah, and I know our organization, AFERM, has also been looking at ideas for potential legislation or other things that would make risk management something more on the books for folks that that's something that needs to be done. So I think that might be helpful as well. So, and just to wrap it up, I think I was just curious, for our listeners here, but, so you did this, I think, based on some things out of Canada. And did you look across different governments across the world to see if anybody out there is implementing anything like this or has these concepts in mind?
I'm not aware of anybody doing it this way and having that kind of role, but I have been aware of meeting several years ago of different approaches in different countries and some of the leading ones around the world. I did, in writing the paper, you mentioned there were a couple of international organizations, mostly U.S.-based, and then one Canadian that was a big funder of this paper. But I did look across various countries, U.S. and allied countries mostly, to see, just in terms of thinking about the objectives, what common objectives might there be and metrics and so forth like that, but not in terms of, I haven't recently researched, I haven't been monitoring over the last year or so the different practices, but I would be surprised if this role existed the way we're describing it yet.
Right, but you are seeing it obviously in state and local governments, federal governments of different nations, correct?
Yes, in fact, I just heard recently that the newly elected mayor of Chicago apparently had made it part of her platform to have a chief risk officer and have it be a prominent position on her staff, and so they're looking to fill that position. So I'm encouraged. I'm waiting to see it pop up more and more. You're right. I would like to see it pop up more cities, more states, and I think that's the general trend. I'm hoping for that.
Well, Sim, I love this paper. I want everybody to read it who's listening today, and we really appreciate you coming on to talk about it.
Thanks so much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
That's our show. Thanks for joining us. As always, visit our website, AFERM.org. There you can find this podcast and many others. You can also find the links for today's podcast. We'll have the paper that Sim wrote. You can follow along, unless you already did that at the beginning of the podcast, but you can do it now afterwards as well. And we have quite a full docket of podcasts for you this end of the summer. So go and check us out frequently. And until next time, this is Paul Marshall signing off for Risk Chats with AFERM.